So thank you, Tasneem, for that. Can everyone hear? Everyone can hear? Yeah, okay, good. For that introduction. Part of this talk, I think, will ruminate or will maneuver another endeavor that I started with a very young group of professionals, which has been quite an endearing experience over the last couple of years, and that is a photography quarterly by the name of PIX, supported on the one hand, it's all right, it's okay, supported on the one hand by the Japan Foundation and then of course the Goethe Institute as well. And this has been a kind of, it's been a simultaneous endeavor in the sense that what is the space that we can inhabit within the archive? Is there something called an archive of contemporary practices? And how does this to an extent connect with a vintage anomaly? So I will begin now. I would like to consider for today a kind of tenuous ground, one that seeks to look at and pontificate the primacy of objects, how they are forms of refracting the past, often for exhibitions, for practitioners who are drawn to the field of photography more generally. PIX, for those of you who are part of it, this was our last issue called Recovery, inspired by the tsunami in Japan. So those of you who are part of it, readers and photographers, it is about diagnosing, in a sense, saturation levels, or gauging saturation levels in practice. The oversaturated image on a screen or printed or moving is sometimes forced. Colors are out of range, they might be overdense, the lines thicken, the borders interlace with bodies. Maybe this can go higher? Is that all right? Okay. I think of condensed empty space, shadow lines, a restless horizon of contestation, the deadpan, or the accident when I think of the contemporary, which I began to consider when I want to kind of imagine the afterlife. What happens when an image has been taken and is over? What happens once the archive becomes that which it should not, pure nostalgia? So for me, stepping into the life of an image, and this is one drawn from the recovery issue, in the contemporary, it is an impossible position to control, but it is certainly about being born within circumstances. Images are not mere reflections, but surfaces brewing with a kind of supplication, living and remembering. The terms of engagement with an image from the archive, forcing its way into the present, is fraught with possibilities. It is kind of fraught with casualties, a chance taken to consider or to forget time. But nevertheless, a world that is three-dimensional, brought together through two eyes, and not merely the one of the lens. Tosco Pepe was a photographer for the descriptive ethnology of Bengal in 1872, an anthropological study in the region, and referred to these two barely clad women, or natives, as wild, timid creatures. Such an oriental fantasy played out in the larger context of the imperial gaze upon India, also kind of visible in pictorial compositions of women composed as Grecian figures within the artist's studio. We are then compelled to ponder how the subject, often peering directly into the lens, would have described the photographer wandering in their midst. Did they ever see their images magically imprinted on paper, and were they told why? Perhaps a similar kind of description could have been accorded to this contemporary photograph of a sadhu in present-day Banaras, playfully entitled Foreign Invasion. To my sensibility, it manifests a conceptual parallel with a vintage anomaly of a similar subject. Shot by an emerging photographer from Calcutta, Devansh Jhaveri, captures the essence of how an outsider appears displaced by the sacred act of a Khareshwari Baba, who has taken a vow to remain standing for 10 years in order to perform a penance. When compared with an image from the 19th century of a contortionist sadhu, a fairly common sight in colonial postcards, can such a contrast be perceived as an image's afterlife, a cultural reanimation entering a discursive field in which the beholder as well as the subject become reference points about the ambivalence of identity? And so we have India going in and out of focus, addressing the intangible in the 19th as well as the 20th century. Images then are as much about an encounter with time as about transcending that sense of time, as much about an engagement with the ground reality, as about ideologically breaking norms that were established in the 19th century, and as much about the dividing lines of place and race and birth as about crossing that threshold to embrace a new identity. But a display practice, to an extent, is important in the context of the 19th century and was about creating a space that shaped the history of the present. These are Oriental, as it were, exhibitions held in India in the 19th century, or just some images of them. However, at the root of that controlled zone, which was often temporary, restricted by the bounds of space, lay the prospect of scrutinizing an object. Exhibitions of the colonies were popular even in the 19th century, associated with the linked fields of patronage, record keeping, especially in the three capital cities of the British presidency, Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, which were witness to the earliest arrival of the camera in India. Perhaps those displays that we see even in this photograph also shed light on how the 1990s has witnessed the popularization of the biennales as vehicles of economic development, trying to gauge a country's reputation as a cultural center and thereby creating critical modes of artistic or institutional empowerment. And that is a projection that we had of PICs within such a context in Brazil a few years ago. Coming to another kind of exhibitionary practice, and I will do this throughout today, is take a few leaps. I would like to introduce you to the story of Ramendra Narayan in the early 20th century. He was one of the Kumars of the Bhau estate, and he was one of three brothers who had inherited this estate from his father. By 1905, he had contracted syphilis and traveled to Darjeeling to seek treatment from a healer, but died there in 1910. His body was cremated, and the following morning, customary funerary rites were performed. A saint appears in this village a few years hence, claiming to be the very same ruler. Some witnesses claimed that, in fact, a sudden hailstorm had interrupted the cremation, and the body might have disappeared as the mourners had sought shelter. An entire court case ensues around a group of images of the prince in an attempt to ascertain the true identity of the Kumar. Eventually, after an estimated 10-year trial, which includes testimonies by villagers and nobles, the land is returned to the mystic ruler, though his widow never, as it were, validates this claim, and when he eventually dies, she doesn't accept the inheritance which rightly belongs to her. These images are in the Al-Qazi collection. The interface between law and photography, the use of images to trace hairlines, body structure, facial features, a dactylographic means strikes me as a significant interjection about the ambivalence of images as pure fact. An entire litigation rested around photos that were circulated in the public, literally as exhibits in favor of the plaintiff. What better understanding of a studio's photographs' ability to affect a change than the legal judgments that have developed as a result of their circulation, what greater power and effect could a display possibly have? In the contemporary, however, more often than not, historical material, even objects such as photographs, rarely are seen as starting points, but moments of return. And in taking this view, historical material is often being appropriated to the production of works in the contemporary rather than a point of initiation necessarily. And so cultural practitioners, this is one of the shows that we have done using this material, cultural practitioners, whether they be artists, writers, musicians, painters, and even photographers, have interminably tried to understand the varied ways in which we should and we do look beyond borders today, and whether those lines of separation monitor the inner workings and deeper cultures of engagement in our dealings with art, or curatorial practice envisaged on the practice of an art. In Brazil, however, when we tried this as an ongoing expose on India, it kind of purposefully avoids chronology with an emphasis on theme, the use of insinuation or reflection rather than a sense of the temporal or even an aesthetic progression. In some cases, iconic works that are being featured on the history of the vintage as a whole. So photography is, in a sense, realized as a form of cultural production in the present that lays claim to a past. And this is mediated and transformed by the act of display. And here, sometimes contemporary practitioners do, and they have, responded in many ways to cultural dilemmas in self-conscious ways that often remain caught within the discrepancies created by colonial history or the paradigms of this history. Ranging from a patron displaying his regalia, imaging his courtesans, celebrating an investiture, composing a family, the studio has remained an imagined space with an idealizing tendency. However, while looking at a photograph of a transsexual person, Monorama in Calcutta today by Siddharth Hazara, I was compelled to ponder the existence of a similar moment in the 19th century, arriving at an image by Chunnilal of eunuchs taken in the 1880s. There is a sense of an emancipation from one frame to the other, compelling the viewer to locate the origins of gendered identities as independent facets of a later, more complex, more infused cross-section. This facet, in a sense, has also been highlighted in the emerging recent fight for gender equality in India, starting with the decriminalization of homosexuality by the Supreme Court. And these are images by Monica Davar, who submitted for pics. However, a sense of the photograph's growing strength and often contradictory responses can also be brought to bear on the authoritarian closing of exhibitions, such as that of Sunil Gupta's at the Alliance Française in Delhi last year, entitled Sun City and Other Stories, which previously received acclaim at the Pompidou Center of Art in Paris. And so the traceable history through images in India underestimates the power and struggle that has shaped it, declaring their permanence, offering how a fragile object like a photograph, paper on which these images are printed, can be about a mysterious kind of intellectual traffic, social network, or cultural specificity. The so-called straightforward mode of documentation shapes the nature, as it were, of early photography, a socio-commercial world that siphons the photographer into its momentum at the end of the 19th century. The subject and the practitioner enter a world of marketable oriental products, moving from an exhibitionary initiative to forms of a cult practice with the passage of time. This is manifested in the depiction of the Todas, particularly in India, pioneering work on whom was done by Henry Harkness, a member of the army in the 1830s. Though his renditions were sketches, they are reference to a scientific bent of mind that appeared radical, manifested in later portraits of the Todas as Adam and Eve. But this confounding, in a sense, between the internal and the external leads to a space that we will create, that is almost at a cross, a twilight region where the object cannot be seen merely as a point of remembrance, but a living concern. And so furthermore, the use of anthropometry, a technological means of engineering a desired result based on a mathematical equation with race, cultural value, and physiology. This is something in the 21st century that Pushpamala N and Claire Ani have collaborated on and projected. A cephalic index explores the dire consequences of equating race and hierarchy with physicality. Could Pushpamala have inferred that physiognomy undercut man's dealing with one another at a humanitarian level? Therefore, this modern ethnographic series that she does, titled Native Women of South India, this is some time ago, between 2000 and 2004, pushes the colonial archive to yet another frontier, the subversion of a colonial science. In the 19th century, or the archive that the 19th century have, manages to yield an array of circumstances in which the portrait resounds with the notion of classification. The native becomes a kind of object, a subject that can be tempered with a descriptive sentence, defining his code of conduct as an unflailing trait. The face represents a blueprint, a map that is devoid of sentiment, devoid of emotion, but rather a fact sheet. It is a database. It was in a sense a moment at which all characteristics are rendered obsolete and the person becomes a fingerprint. In the eyes of society, his actual person becomes invisible. And this is the point at which one may ponder the works of Japanese photographer Yoshida Kimiko in Invisible Portrait. She says that the state of invisibility I put on display is connected with the radical demand of art. So images can, in a sense, be about their opposites, not about revealing, but actually about shading something from light, not about light acting upon paper, but in a sense, the darkness creeping through. Quite differently, the portraits of Yoshida are confabulations of types that arise from her mentations as an artist, an individual, dealing with iconicity and dealing with objecthood. Her sense of deep colors, stark, strange, captivates and deepens the effect of her analog images. At the same time, there is a complex referentiality, in a sense, with the history of photography in Japan that these images suggest. Seen in the early albums of Felice Beato, the inveterate Italian photographer traveling through Japan in the 1860s, shooting not only the sights, but the samurai, the courtesans, further investing them with manually applied Fuji color. Yoshida too mentions that before she took on her life as a photographer, she left her home carrying photos of her samurai ancestors. So the contemporary, in a sense, her images over here, manifests a unique stance, tempering larger discussions on photo practice, those of visual trajectory, even occultism. It is not only about celebrating an individuality, finding a resonance across the board, but a movement from, let us say, image to message. This is where the world becomes that matrix we are talking about, by digital media, conditioned by an analog past, forged by a virtual invader of photography in Asia, and the paradigm shift in the aesthetics of engagement that occur henceforth. Those living in exile, often willfully outside their motherland or fatherland, but with an eye to their origins, to their upbringing, to their conditioning. But from the private to the public, there seems to be a revision of norms. What, for instance, is the display worthiness of objects such as these in the archive? The postcard as an entity was one of the largest dispensers or exhibitors of the photographic image in the early 20th century. An official estimate records that there were close to over 700 million postcards circulating throughout the world in the early 20th century, a lot of whose sort of subject matter was Indian. What do they tell us about private taste, about public awareness, or indeed about photojournalism at the time. Postcards and carte de visites become the forerunners in creating an image of India. And even though India was by no means the country to introduce mass prints or popular forms, this happens with the permeation of images on postcards. The dying and the dead are moving from one empty space to another ephemeral one. And what else do they become but objects on display? But perhaps in this movement is a mutation of sorts. They are changing, translating our corpus of encounter into a litany of how the perished become signifiers of a presence, of how a famine becomes a statement on the subject of human existence and compels us to question what led to this mode of desecration. Is this like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, conflicted, embroiled, immaculate, where all beings entwine and create this creature of epic scale? The Madras Famine of 1876-78 was shot by a number of photographers, including Hooper and another man by the name of Penn. As the rains failed in Madras, the prices of grains rose to an unprecedented height, exacerbated by their export to London. The skeletal families moved from one place to another, leading to the spread of disease, mass malnutrition. And after several years, the editor of the Madras Times claimed that there were 10.3 million people who perished at this point of time in India. The visuals show the fate, hence, of human bodies reduced to those fragile or ghostly essences. These illusory liberations of the weight and trappings of identity seem to reduce the image itself to a kind of shadow. We are then close, perhaps, can we suggest that we are close to the realm of art with images like this, and perhaps dangerously so? For could not this dreamlike state of flesh and blood nothingness, nowhereness, of surreal identitylessness be part of our understanding of historical fact over time? Taking a leap in time, we have images taken by Sunil Jana much later in the 1960s. And how do they feature in comparison to the archive of images or the poetics of discontentment which affect the works of artists even such as Somnath Haur? This sculpture of Somnath arrests the viewer with the fate of human bodies reduced again to a ghostly essence. Does the contemporary then replace the norms of encounter within an archive? How does it challenge the past, yet appear to be its true benefactor? What then do pictures want? We know that the nature of archives in 50 years will change, the acquisition of works in the present representing the construction of identity, the deconstruction, the devolution of a heritage. And where does this occur again, or regain itself again, but in the portrait of photography? Photography allowed for a more direct approach to physical features like the face, the hands, the body, an exposure that did not shy away from the viewer but allowed for complete identification. The portrait of these two veiled princes seems to subvert the prime function of portraiture. It presents a symbolic reference to the marriage of an uncle. On the other hand, the dramatic images of their grand aunt, the Begum of Bhopal, the first female ruler of South Asia, as it were, herself informs us about the custom of parda. And this was not only strictly associated with women at the time. As a ruler considered divine by her subjects, she was exempt from the usual constraints faced by women at the time. In this aspect, she was no different than princely men who now and for time have appeared in miniatures from the Mughal court. Here we find them from an album called the Waterhouse Album, featuring the Begums of Bhopal. On the other hand, you have the works of Daroga Abbas Ali from the Lucknow court, again visualizing women. But then we again arrive at this document, the Rajas and Talukdars of Awadh, exposing an equivalent, that of an industrial production of portraiture, as a means aimed at consolidating the allegiance of an entire social class of landlords. The album is important because it presents, in documenting people, in documenting events, namely the reselling of property. And 37 of these 344 carte de visite images give the name of the sitter, but instead of the face of the sitter, you have merely a medallion, as you can see in the right-hand side corner. This was a courtesy extended to all the females, both Muslim and Hindu, with the result that the only faces that you see in this are those of men. But where the private and the public cross from viewership in a circumscribed arena to that in a public norm, there is a kind of revision of norms. The Begum's face cannot be seen in public, yet her presence must always be felt. How then do we decipher a similar expression of norms in the photographs of young prostitutes in India taken by Sunny Lamba, again from pics, who is being wedded, the girls are being wedded to free them from the bounds of their professional lives. Is this representation on the obscurity of identity one that defaces the position of the identity of the other person? Can hands be considered the veils of identity? Are their faces meant to be seen through this thin cloth in order to maintain both sight and distance at the same time? Responding later with, let us say, similar intent, that of a human mask or a human veil, are the works of Raqs Media Collective in India, a contemporary art collective and curatorial team, which I'm sure all of you know. And this body of work was entitled "The Surface of Each Day is a Different Planet." It was an installation constructed with furniture, illumination, projected with a single screen video, and of course with archival images as well. Here Raqs explores the archive of images from the Galton collection, a man who was a mathematician, a polymath. He attempted to find the iconic face of criminals in the crowd by superimposing them through multiple exposures, but eventually succeeded only in generating a gentle composure, devoid of any violent inclinations, therefore going against the practice. Similarly, you have the works of Yoshito Minuzo, a Japanese physiognomist in the 1930s, who thought that better naval officers could be found when you superimposed the photos of good naval officers and came up with a composure like that. Do these examples then suggest proof of an alternative human existence that shuffles somewhere in the crowd, where the complex overlaying of people may reveal a renewed human core, a complex kind of DNA? The act of creating an image from a composite is an attempt at reconstructing, therefore, the singularity of a photograph, the single focus, the individual face, or even the one print. Here the composite is a reality show that holds a mirror to history, you could say, while its ripples ask for a second, a third, or a future anomaly. Is it then, as Kazuo Ishiguro would state, on the subject of clones, a futuristic way of going ancient? Is this what the archive does? Portraiture and iconicity then share an interconnected value, with specific reference to India, even though it was by no means the country to introduce mass prints in popular art. Mechanical reproductions, like the photograph, took on an independent life as sacred icons, revealing a curious interplay of portraiture and religious life, which we can see sometimes in the works of Natwara. This is also indeed influenced by the coming of the painted photograph, which I've talked about in the past, one that changed the interactions with monochrome forever. With the introduction of a new mass media, printed images were transmuted into portable icons for household use, the coming of popular culture in that manner. These prints thus lost what Walter Benjamin would call an exhibitionary value and took on what we would call a cult value. And this was engaged in again with some students of JNU who tried to recreate aspects of this by dressing up in front of the camera with using painted backdrops. And this was again done with Pushpamala a few years ago. Perhaps similar initiatives at the early 20th century finally permitted any individual from an enlarging middle class or professional class to satirize and challenge the world's notables, those who were brought into a common purview through the dissemination of mass images. And he or she was able to step out of this quotidian round and enter a world populated with figures of beauty, fashion, high public distinction. And so, ever since it was invented, the camera's faithfulness to truth assisted in the validation of an identity, the seamless construction and erosion of categories. The photograph moves upward in the market as much as it stirs across cultural frontiers. To be imprisoned by light on the surface of an image for an exhibition, this frightening prospect was always prying in the minds of the people working, who were being documented in the 19th century. Are we then always looking at a photographer's unmappable sense of his or her own images, the manner in which he shoots and sees, or do we contest authorship in images when shown in the context of an exhibition? My sense, for instance, of that distant world with a disorienting sense of time. And so, coming closer to this conclusion, I'd like to show you this image. As families, reporters, and rescue teams waited for daybreak on March 11th, 2011, in order to gauge the complete scale of damage caused by the earthquake in Tohoku, Japan. They needed light, exposure, and time to rescue the survivors and map the after effects of one of the biggest natural disasters in 5 decades. Photographers were drawn to the location from all corners of the world, eventually sharing their images of estranged sites, a topsy-turvydom brought on by a tilt of the earth, distressed yet bizarrely beautiful. And if such imagery brings to life the contorted reality on the ground, perhaps photography ponders an uncertainty. Can it challenge, document, alter, and redefine space as intellectual traffic? Does the unknown contemporary archive of images edge its way into the contemporary through a kind of disturbance or through a kind of invitation? And I think at PIX we believe that this answer lies with every citizen, and hence we did this issue of PIX on the theme of recovery a few months ago. Just last month. I come to another image over here, a different kind of mess that occurs in the 19th century, not of a space, but of people. And this is an image by Felice Beato. For those of you who know it, it is disinterred bones by the photographer in front of Sikandar Bagh, taken in 1858. An image that was used again as part of a performance a few years ago in Brussels. And so these developments in photography between the vintage and the contemporary also signal how mixtures, fusions, collaborations that were developed in the 18th or 19th century were divided into new categories in the 20th. It definitely happened to objects like photographs that when dispersed or disposed of were put under new headings in new hands. It happened to people in photographs who when changed countries or loyalties took on new identities. It happened to spaces in photographs that when seen by the naked eye created or gave you a sense of the traces of the past. And so we have to know that in endeavors like images, since there is a globalization of images and it has endless labyrinths of mergers and mediascapes, this becomes an immense point of imaginative potential. But if we do indeed celebrate the demise of an imperial culture of visualization, perhaps in our own midst are alternating forms of construction. And so given in India we have had a varied encounter with photography for 170 years, any engagement with it in the current scenario entails work that assumes to undo a bet or evolve from what has been done in the past. The bearing of such an exposition therefore highlights distinct modes of encounter, maybe the imperial, maybe nationalistic, definitely post-colonial. And these represent, in a way, continuities, ruptures, contradictions that have given a modern aesthetic to South Asia in the last 100 years. And this is a world, in a sense, that we found through pics, a world of global capitalism to an extent, of citizenship, of neo-imperialism, of minorities, of exile, of secularism, and these are the boundaries, you could say, that need to be transgressed for a more humanist understanding of the contemporary world. And so in order to do so, our next issue of pics is dedicated to Iran as a space of encounter. And we will be having that show in July later this year, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Please speak into the mic, okay? If you'd like, raise your hand, introduce yourself, and speak into the mic.
It's a kind of work in progress, so your questions can help tease out a lot of ideas for me too. So it might be. Incidentally, just to do, meanwhile, while the silence is persist, a little bit of shameless self-promotion. This is our next book that is going to be launched. It's on Raja Deen Dayal's work. It's going to be launched at the Royal Ontario Museum for those of you who might be there or have friends there in early May. And it's our 8th book from the archive that we've done with the help of scholars internationally. And it's an ongoing process. And hopefully books like those will arise from the contemporary as well. And that is the endeavor with pics, which is also lying somewhere here. There, that's our latest issue, featuring about 12 photographers. Thank you. Featuring about 12 photographers from India, South Asia, but also a few from Japan. So the point through this talk was really to try to connect in my head points, images or references from the archive with the contemporary, and take tangential liberties while doing so.
Rahab, about a week ago, we all gathered together under the auspices of the galleries to hear a gentleman, an art critic from London, and he was talking about how the photograph really has now become the dominant image in contemporary art. That almost every form of contemporary art, installation, painting, whatever, references or includes a photographic, even a painting would reference a photographic image, and of course then mediate it. And he showed lots of examples of how that was being done now, but that mostly it is the photograph, and the photograph is migrating even into video and into film, more video art. Have you thought about that? And it's very interesting because when we talked about it, he sort of suggested that it's because it's a mediated reality, a reality that is at several removes. It's reality, but it's still really not a reality because it's a particular perspective. It suggests all that you talked about in the lecture. But I'm interested also in if you've thought about about that migration into the video and how it is going to become really the form of interaction, of interface, of artistic interface in a sense, as we go forward looking at even digital and what that suggests.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's no avoiding the image, certainly, or the photograph or the still image. We were talking about it earlier in our class, and we've realized that the number of images in the world has outrun that of human bodies. So we are dealing with, as it were, a media that has a surfeit involved. It is an excessive media. It needs to have lines of control, or does it? And that has been a sense of an image to be grappled with. How do you exactly realize which images matter and which do not, which are legitimate? Is there a high and low sense or hierarchy that you can create through images circulating? And certainly I think contemporary artists, the PIX issue that we did before this was a special issue on Sri Lanka, and certainly Sri Lanka has had a biennale quite recently where a lot of artists such as Anoli Pereira use this sort of idea of the still moving image as part of their installations. But interestingly enough, even with the Rux work I was talking about, The Surface of Every Day is a Different Planet, was an installation of this kind. They recently had another one at the Photographers Gallery in London using images from the Archaeological Survey of India. So I think, sort of traversing the various forms of art, you then go beyond applied photography, and then you insinuate ideas of the allied arts that come within play. So we often use, for instance, apart from, let us say, structural anomalies, and of course all our exhibitions some of them end up taking the form of installations unto themselves, because photographers want to see their works as installations now, as things that that involve distance and nearness, that things change as you go closer and as you move further away. And I think that is the power that images have, and certainly in a situation like in India, which has an art fair, which has a vibrant gallery culture, and that culture is actually permeating globally, and works of art that are being affected, or that Indians are over here affected by on an international scale, I would say have to do with points of the developments in art per se. So things that are happening in Europe, you are finding over here, and all artists are dealing with levels of emulation and reproduction, but of course using material that is common to them. And I think that form of expression is the result of many reasons. Certainly display practices have a lot to do with it. Certainly a demand of a gallery world has to do with it, and certainly transitions in art practice have something to do with it. So it's tempting, if that's what you're asking, for a photographer to end up doing installation work. It's tempting for a person who's done fine art to end up making an installation with images. And these are, the cross-networkings that are part of the media practitioners or cultural practitioners that has developed out of an artist, as it were, today. And I think there are different definitions that we've arrived at today because of these exchanges. So often when you do go abroad, this is what you hear, or this is how you express the role of an artist as a cultural practitioner. And so using different media is, I think, innate to that form of expression. For me, that's what I think. Yes, Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Hapgood. Can you talk a little bit about the way that 19th century photographs, which were not necessarily, or were in many cases not made to be works of art,
Yes.
are absorbed and historicized within museums as aesthetic objects? I know you touched upon it. I arrived late. Maybe you spoke about it a lot in the beginning, but I find it kind of fascinating the way this museum net catches these things that were never intended to be in a museum per se, and
Okay.
that's one of that's the decisive factor in the way we talk about these objects or these
Right.
images.
Well, I think there are two or three things about photography that arrive at. The Great Exhibition of 1851 that people know as the Great Exhibition actually invited photographs to be part of their collections back then. A lot of museums in Calcutta was hosting a lot of these imperial exhibitions, and for the first time the directors of the Calcutta Museum invited images to be part of fine art displays. So fine art photography as a form of a practice that gets into the museum has been around actually for a very, very long time, and has actually been initiated by that initiative. The People of India series is the easiest example to take. It was by the Cannings, meant for an exhibition originally, And they specified this while telling photographers to travel the length and breadth of India. So the museumizing practice or the study of ethnology or ethnography, these have actually contributed to the making of early photography in India. Only later, only in the latter half, do you have the arrival of commercial photographers who are not shooting for statehood, as it were. But the early endeavors are meant to be part of this kind of record keeping or surveillance that becomes part of the museum world to a great extent. Shown over here and shown internationally, Felice Beato's early work is shown all across the world, all across the museums. But they are also seen as artifacts.
Those are the ones that fall within, it makes sense that they're looked at within, those are the images that it makes sense that they're within this infrastructure. I'm talking more about like the famine, photo documentation or photojournalism or portraiture or family albums or things that were never intended to be in a museum.
So you're talking about museum practice today,
incorporating
these.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear about that. I mean today. I find it fascinating that all photographs suddenly just get swooped into museum, the museum structure.
Well, I mean, for us at least, having done this sort of initiative with museums, and we have one, if you can consider the Rubin Museum to be a space at which our next show is going to be at the Rubin Museum sometime in October this year on South Asian portrait photography. And then, of course, another one in Brussels as part of the Europalia Festival at the Royal Fine Art Museums in Brussels. And they are definitely sort of trying to trace a trajectory about the pictorial history of photography, the fin de siècle sort of idea, where you have images representing a kind of posed, artful pose in a sense, but also coming together to represent tastes and trends at the time. Now, family albums and so on in the 19th century are not easy to come by. You, of course, do come by them. We have quite a few, like the Tresidder album. But of course, family albums then were also, in a sense, highly political. Of course, they were cultural. So the family album of a Tresidder would have images of Tresidder on the one hand and his entire family, but it would have his establishment of paid servants. It would have an Agra circle of photographers who were shooting at the time. It would have sites of the mutiny that were memorialized. It would have people who were sent on death row in shackles after the mutiny. So they become these strange, complex anomalies that show a transection of histories, not only an art history, but certainly a cultural history because of the political implications. And I think that's very tempting because they stand for evidence today very often. But of course, we have to understand, and the point of this was understand the ambivalences of that when you're showing within a museum space, because certainly the people of India, it was meant for this initiative, but if you look at the text surrounding the people of India, it's what we would consider to be highly derogatory. It actually looks down upon most Indians all the time. So certainly for us, in a sense, 19th century photography is also looked at, for these purposes, but as artifacts emerging that have a visual quality, that also resonate other material objects within the image that are difficult to now find, or aspects of history that have disappeared. So another reason why we did the Lucknow show, or aspects of that a few years ago abroad, was that so many sites within Lucknow have disappeared and only the image remains as a reference point for something that is now totally gone. So from a restoration conservation point of view, heritage management point of view, they also become important. And so it just depends. I mean, for exhibitions such as Where Three Dreams Cross, which was done by 3 or 4 curators on photography from the 19th century to the 21st, I think those juxtapositions become complex ways of interacting with the 19th century photograph. How do you take a Gauri Gill and put her beside a 19th century? How do you take a Sunil Gupta, Raghu Rai, S. Paul, you name it, and actually create that form of interconnection between history and contemporary? And that is what the protean quality of an image lies in that adaptability, and a way of doing that is a way of moving ahead and arriving at a future, a sense of an image. And I think that's exactly why you have, in a way, this kind of movement to installation work, that you can incorporate 3 or 4 media to create an entire holistic, so-called holistic idea or notion of the past. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nishant. There seems to be an extensive archive of vintage photography across the world, in India, generated and archived like pretty well. Is there a similar thing for video, and if there isn't, why isn't there like extensive archive of video footage, documentary video footage, non-cinematic?
Well, I'm actually not in a position to answer that, but I know that the videos of Orelstein, for instance, that he shot silent films in and around India in the late 19th, early 20th, have been digitized by Cambridge University over the last 5 years, and they have been put online as well. You can access them. So the silent film definitely has spaces which are actually making this endeavor for for documenting them. So certainly it's going to be the case. It's certainly the case at even the Harry Ransom Center in Texas, Austin, where they have this, of course, large collection of the Gernsheims. The Gernsheims were Jews who collected art and who also shot video at the time. They collected the first photograph ever taken by Niepce in 1825, became part of their collection. They eventually sold that entire collection. They settled in Britain. They sold it to the Harry Ransom Center in the 1970s. Videos were part of it. They've been documented. They're online. So I think, I'm not sure whether it's not happening, but certainly these are spaces that are definitely doing it with silent film and then moving on. But if you're, for instance, asking, is there a comprehensive archive of video films that have been looked at as art video films or art films, and if that history has been documented, I'm afraid I don't know.
To do with India, especially.
I'm sorry?
To do with India, especially.
Yeah, so the ones of Orelstein are the ones I know exist for sure. Of course, there's also the one, but these are ones that are more prominent. There's a guy by the name of Rito Nagel in Munich, and he has a large archive of videos of Gandhi. So if you go online, there's a website called the Gandhi Serve Foundation, based in Munich, and they've documented all the films from that period. So there are archives, yeah, certainly there are.
Thanks.
Excuse me. My name is Rashid Wadia. I have a couple of questions. Since I am professionally a historian, I must confess this very interesting lecture is very new to me. For the same reason, it is a bit intimidating. So please give me a few minutes to frame my question. I can see that throughout your lecture, there is a narrative, and a narrative with which I would agree with, of the enormous weight of colonial rule on the construction of notions of photography, etc. As you know, colonial rule was effected through Indians, Now that introduces a problematical thing. Right through the 19th century, looking at this region of Western India and Bombay, from the middle of the 19th century, there is already in Bombay a substantial intelligentsia, articulating their views on various issues through books, magazines, journals. And I think when photography arrived, I think there was also an intervention in the world around photographically.
Yes.
Do you think that those Indians involved in this intervention, in this critical intervention, did enough to grow out of sort of larger paradigm the colonial system set for themselves? Now, I want to mention two major events spread over around 100 years and would like to have your response to this. You know, the opium trade, 1840s. Indians, Bombay merchants were extensively involved in it. But shockingly, with the exception of a couple of intellectuals in Bombay, nobody opposed the opium trade. And thus nobody wrote against it. And thus nobody came out with representations opposing what was an absolute scandal, you know. Now, in your narrative, there is, I think,
I'm going to lose track of your question if you don't ask it soon.
Yeah. You know, there is a considerable emphasis on the colonial impact.
Yes.
And I know where this comes from. I mean, I think it's a very valid narrative. Shouldn't we make extra efforts to understand the Indian failures, quote unquote, in critiquing this narrative even in the 19th century? You know, I mean, do you think Indians did enough to critique this narrative, photographically or in writing? Now, you know, all that appeared by way of photographs in the public domain came alongside printed narratives in newspapers, magazines, books, you know. So both these subjects are actually linked to each other. So please respond to this.
Well, I mean, the opium trade is something that I find quite amusing with the personal history kind of sense of it, because my great-grandfather eventually got married to or ran away with a Chinese lady after consuming copious amounts of opium. And my father sort of recounts this story with great glee and pleasure. And we actually found a few letters written, back home, saying that he was not going to come back home, but eventually he did come back home, came back to Bombay. He was from Bombay. Nevertheless, I think your question is extremely, extremely valid. Also because I have 2 points of reference. Syed Ahmad Khan wrote extensively, as you probably know this, but just so that people here know this, on the People of India series, and he critiqued it. He was at the Victoria and Albert in Britain, and he was researching there in the 19th century, and he actually wrote an extensive body about how that object itself was objectifying Indians to a great extent. This is part of documented history. And in fact, Christopher Pinney, the well-known visual anthropologist, has quite an extensive bit on Syed Ahmad Khan's intervention at that point of time with a particular photographic object. Certainly, it's the case with the Bombay Gazetteer and other, Dainik Bazar Patrikas coming out at the time, for instance, of the Delhi Darbar, which is the time at which famines occur throughout India. So there's a great, critical intervention made by the press to an extent. This also happens with photographers by the name of Virkar, who come from Girgaon and document the Quit India movement of the 1930s, the Lathi charges and so on and so forth. And I believe Virkar's archive still exists with the family, and they don't know what to do with it. Maybe someone can find a space for it and have that archive here. There's also, for instance, Abdul Halim Sharar's The Last Phase of an Oriental Culture, where he talks about, Wajid Ali Shah, and Wajid Ali Shah was a kind of person who eventually succumbed to British interventions after the mutiny, but also talking about how there was this entire court case that rested around something he called the Blue Book, which were, charges against you and his petitions against that. So certainly there are traces, and I actually personally do feel that if we go back in history, you will find many interventions being made. Certainly that's how I imagine we gained our independence, because of this constant press against imperialism. If you're asking whether imperialism was from within, I think, yes, aspects of that do exist. We were looking at images in our class earlier today, again of the Begum of Bhopal, and of course, all the princely rulers, substantiate themselves by having the Star of India showing their allegiance to the British crown. of course, subverting them all the time or trying to subvert them all the time. But, you know, they did agree to strange things. The Begum of Bhopal agreed to send the entire Sanchi Stupa, which was under her jurisdiction, off for an exhibition in South Kensington in the 1860s, and said, yes, they sent a ship to transport that entire monument away. But then you had interventions of Sir John Marshall and others, who effectively said that it is a logistical nightmare. Sir John Marshall was the director of the Archaeological Survey of India, that we must preserve this monument in situ, in place, and I think in situ restoration begins from initiatives like this. And they did not move the Sanchi Stupa. They made a plaster cast of it. And that is what is seen even today at the British Museum. So, I mean, it's a mottled history. It's a complex history. And the point of using the visual as an intervening fact, I think, was just to say that we have to tease that history out, because a visual history definitely stands alongside textual history, but it does not always ratify that textual history. And so, you know, there are complexities involved here. I hope that answers your question a little bit, a little bit. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Willis. You spoke a bit about forth and whether that be sepia, black or white, or the saturated color tones from the mid-20th century, in displaying their works, maybe not in galleries, but in the main point of display, which at this point is probably independently hosted. And maybe talk a little bit about in how far the public is returning to some of that color or visual iconography of the archival materials, and how the art world has oftentimes picked on those people and said, you know, it's cheap to do it with the filters on Instagram or on a camera phone.
Well, I mean, the point of, you know, let me begin by saying the point of starting PIX was to actually challenge a mainstream. So, I mean, we did not agree with certain museum practices such as this, and, you know, entering a contemporary visual archive or practice. Certainly there are multitudinous practices that ought to be. And for us, you know, it did become the primacy of the citizen as a documenter of a space. So whether it's a mobile phone or whether it's, you know, any kind of an image becomes an important intervention. However, I mean, I must say yours is, it has thrown me off a little bit, because it's difficult to answer your question. I can only say that through my experience of dealing with contemporary practices, there is no sense for me yet as to where it is going and what and how you legitimize a good photograph, or you legitimize a particular practice of, you know, and a shading and so on, or the coming back of color, or the use of black and white. What does matter is that all of these practices have to filter into our understanding of what, let's say, visual culture is today. And there is a good book that I read recently, if that helps, by a lady called Charlotte Cotton, called Words Without Pictures, where she talks about these interventions being made by private or by curators, you know, as expressing their opinion on their blogs or on their websites. And I think for that to enter or for one to dissuade a museum practice, one has to actually make very, very legitimate claims, because they are looking at works from the archive. They're also looking at simultaneous narratives that have occurred all over the place. And so what is contemporary today might actually enter a gallery space 10 years from now, 15 years from now, if at all. I can tell you in India, for instance, mostly the culture for, let us say, the National Museum or the National Gallery of Modern Art has not been very, I would say, ambivalent anymore, or not that I have seen recently, towards the acquisition of works that are photographic in representing, let us say, a patron culture to photography. So it's difficult to respond to that within the context of India, because museums aren't making necessarily that intervention today here. But certainly it's the case abroad with the V&A, and of course the Bhau Daji has hosted a very interesting exhibition a few years ago of these contemporary works from the Victoria and Albert Museum, but it's strange and ironic that that has not happened from within India itself, that the acquisitions are not really occurring. So basically, the understanding of media is somewhat at a stasis in a sense, because the museum culture is meant to be a great patron at a national level. Not having that creates problems for India now, I think, personally. So that's the way in which I'd like to respond to your question for now. I don't know if I'm right in saying this name. And certainly, you know,
There
I mean,
is-
you would
there
have
is
an
a
idea,
lacuna in that,
running a
and-
museum, you would know about this.
Yes, yes, but, and you know, there are probably not sufficient, except with the exception of yourself now, of course, Susan has done a show recently. There are very few curators who are looking at photography as a medium, you know, in terms of, even in terms of contemporary, precisely in terms of contemporary, rather.
It's difficult. I mean, you know, in order to create that museum practice of collecting, you need bodies, you need agencies, you need constitutions. All of that will be arrived at, certainly. But if interventions aren't made now, then the coming of photography within this culture of acquisition or patronage will not happen 10 years from now. And I think we have to rise to that occasion here, in India now. And which is why any intervention is a good one, I think. So, should we...
Rahab, just a comment. I mean, I'm just intrigued also about how you see the photograph as a document, you know, the kind of documentary photograph that Raghurai and others have done for so long. Do you see that as a practice continuing to be relevant? Just this, obviously, it would be very subjective. Because when you look, for example, when we had a seminar along with the V&A show on contemporary photography, and I'm discussing this with the curator, and increasingly there is the sense that unless just a pure documentary photograph doesn't seem to carry sufficient gravitas, in terms of artistic gravitas. It doesn't seem to convey enough that it needs to be mediated in some way to begin to sort of fit into a sort of contemporary, as a contemporary art practice. And that's a very interesting point. I mean, obviously then it gets included in installations, etc.
Right.
But whether just a standalone documentary photograph, what is the sort of legitimacy of it now?
Well, that's also an interesting question to answer. Certainly when Raghurai and T.S. Satyan, Nimai, and we've seen works of Nimai, Madan Mahatta's works, that generation of photographers. Of course, Pablo's recent work looks at his own archive, his own modern archive. I think let us say the changes that have occurred now are in the realm of the conceptual. So you're right in intimating that fact. Ideas over images is what's happened in the contemporary to a great extent. So very often with PICs as well, we are looking at underlying ideas, but not the gravitas of a single image, but actually a narrativization of images, telling the life or a story, and we actually invite narratives in images to show a series of work. That is the interjection we have tried to make, and thereby doing that through a thematic, we found is a good way to sort of focus how photographers are trying to channel their ideas today. Photographers like Raghurai were, of course, photojournalists, found a great amount of exposure in the press, and that's how they were press photographers, and they had to have the so-called all-encompassing nature of an image because they were trying to talk about, his most recent book on the Bangladeshi conflict, Cry of Freedom, I think it's called, has to do that. It necessarily does do that. So you have this synoptic image in which everything is happening at all times, and it's sort of creating this this great anomaly. However, I had an encounter recently with an Iranian photographer. Her name is Azadeh, in fact, that's her work up there. But what she has done is that in Iran, for instance, there is no documentary practice that actually exists because it's all been censored. There is no freedom of the press, so actually documentary photography is the most difficult to do over there. In fact, they have something called staged photography, which is very, very, extensively practiced in Iran. So what Azadeh has done to create this all-encompassing image is that she's actually gone through written documents from 1900s onwards till about the 1960s and actually pulled out all the documents that talk about the massacres of left-wing people, writers, poets, painters in Iran. Not having a visual to support it, she's actually used a film production team to recreate the moment of their death. She's taken a photo of that, but she's inserted herself inside every photo in a corner and called it the eyewitness. So for me, that is using, for instance, what a Raghu Rai would have done. I'm just talking about it conceptually, Raghu Rai or the great photographers would have done, but adding a contemporary gravitas to it by actually looking at an untraceable, unrecognizable, non-existent history and creating an image out of that non-existent history. So if those interventions are made today, then I think, the contemporary has great force and I can actually use what the great modern photographers also have done. And I think maybe then this is the time where those great modern photographers have to talk about their reference points, their lineages, because unless the great photographers in India do this now, I don't think the contemporary will be able to find ways of referencing their own work, necessarily. And I think that is important. How did Raghu Rai shoot an image? Who were his points of reference? Who was he inspired by? I don't know if he... And for any modern photographer, this is a great time to do that because I think there will be a lot of people willing to hear what they have to say and where they've come from. And that is what will help legitimizing a modern image from the 60s, 70s is what you're talking about today. And luckily we had the great privilege of doing that with Humayun, as you know. She was very articulate about what she was, she did an entire book on this subject, but she was rare in that. You don't find many people actually talking about or referencing their points of inspiration or affectation. So.
I think it's anybody else? Abhay? No. Please.
Regular museums would generally require a lot of floor space, unlike something for photographs which would not take up a lot of space. So would you think that museums online would sort of help in...
Yes.
I mean, is there any move to have such displays online?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think, for instance, we have made a lot of our collection available. It's a continuing sort of process. We're trying to make it available online, certainly. If PIX matters and if there's a contemporary, all of PIX is online. You can download all our issues for free from the internet as well. IGNCA has a big collection of, in fact, copy negatives of Deen Dayal, which they've put online. So the Chau Mahalla Palace has a great collection, which they are also putting online. So the online initiative is definitely on the rise, and I think everyone has arrived at the point at which they are agreeing to it, barring, of course, copyright issues in India, which are difficult to maneuver. Certainly, we have a lawyer who sort of talks about usage rights, and that's what happens in India. You're talking about rightful usage in the context of copyright. But certainly you have to know that all 19th century photos are copyleft, they are copyright free. There is no copyright. If you actually find one, scan it up and put it up, you won't go to jail. But don't take my word for it. Find out a little more about this, but I'm fairly sure this is the case. However, usage is an important thing. So if it belongs to an institution that has acquired it, getting permission from them for a usage is important. That means a usage in this particular article for this particular time. Those kind of permissions are important, and that comes within the purview of copyright. So there are ways in and, certainly in and out of this, but I think that drive is on completely.
Hi.
Hi. Bye.
Thanks, Rahab. That was a really stimulating talk. But I'm just a little perturbed about a few things. One,
Yes.
of course, is this deep desire that I suddenly feel of asking you, in fact, to conduct some kind of a diagnosis of
Conducted?
to engage in some kind of a diagnosis
Yes.
of what I perceive to be some kind of a deliberate, yet very impressive conceptual complication.
Right.
At the very outset, I assume that the contemporary for you is a kind of a site which hosts the contract between the temporal and the spatial,
Yes.
as prefigured in the idea of the here and the now.
Okay. Yes.
And the second, it also, I guess, means, or at least in some measure you project it as some kind of a category that releases some kind of a pause, right? Which allows for a kind of a critical recursivity, right? And in that context, you talk about, I'm going to take just two examples that you
Yes.
used as illustrations. The subject as the object, where you have the contorted sadhu in the 1860s and the... And
I'm
the-
sorry, can you just
the,
repeat
I'm
the
sorry,
example?
the contorted, the sadhu, the
Yes.
contortionist,
Yes, yes.
okay, from the
Contortionist
19th
sadhu,
century.
yeah.
From the 19th century, and the one that you, one that was shot recently, I guess.
Yes, by Devansh, yes.
Right. And then, of course, the subject is the object, of course, but also the way in which a gesture sort of, keeps on sort of becoming a part of a larger action replay, as it were. And in this context, we talk about the idea of the parda, whether it's the Begum of Bhopal or whether it's the,
The work of Sunny Lamba.
yes,
who I-
the prostitute.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering about how the idea of the afterlife, comes
play.
comes and sort of installs itself in the discourse that you present before us. Because as it seems to me, the contemporary, as a conglomeration of various events and moments, actually allows us to lay out the process by which a photograph sort of seeks and finds resonances over time, right?
Right.
So in other words, the act of actually sort of engaging in this sort of very high and very long jump at the same time, where you pick out one instance from the 19th century and then suddenly one instance from the contemporary present,
Right.
Actually denies the very idea of contemporaneity itself, which assumes that contemporaneity, in fact, is a kind of a concatenation of several moments that are strung together in a
Right.
completely uneven manner.
Right.
Right? So which means that the figure of the prostitute or the transgendered,
Yes.
sort of performer, say in the 19th century, okay, has in fact found different kinds of counter images or parallel images
Right.
immediately after it has been installed in the 19th century in the works of several people. And, the sadhu, of course, as you know better than most people, has been shot to death
Yes.
by, people like Raghu Rai, Raghubir Singh, so on and so forth.
Right.
So
That also goes back.
right. So I'm just wondering
Old
about
radiance.
the sort of methodology, and the sort of sense of adventure that you have.
Anyone like to answer that question?
You know, I think this is, it's more
And-
like a comment. I mean,
Yes, it is.
obviously.
No, but I'm-
It's an
I could-
observation, and
I
I'm
could
just
do a little bit with that. I could
Sure,
do a little
sure,
bit
sure,
impromptu
Sure,
with that.
sure, sure.
Just a little.
right.
I really have to thank you for that. It's becoming a therapy session for me this evening. The insinuation with the afterlife was from an archival mode. I should have made that clear.
Well, the word afterlife itself is an afterlife, as you know. I mean, you have Benjamin talking about it.
So,
you have Barth talking about it. So.
But so while going through an archive as an archivist, one encounters many things and one classifies many things. One doesn't necessarily find everything in one space and in one time, so those leaps for me had to necessarily be made. In trying to understand how living today as I do, looking at that is necessarily got a tint or patina of my understanding of what's going on in the contemporary as well. So those resonances that were created definitely from the contemporary, looking back at history, were meant to insinuate that within 20 years from now, looking at it from a futuristic sense, that sense of my understanding is necessarily going to morph. It's not going to remain static. And so if there is an after image, let us say, of an image, and I think every image has a life, so there's an after moment that it can share with the contemporary, then that is also difficult to trace unless I'm looking at contemporary practice as it exists through PICS for me now, having initiated this. And I think to an extent, Hegel has always been at the back of my mind. You can probably tell. The 19th century thesis, the 21st century antithesis, and the synthesis of ideas leading to another kind of thesis which will have an antithesis. So there is a sense of Hegel's work in phenomenology that I've done a little bit on, that I've tried to incorporate through this talk. It's actually running through it. But it's certainly not found itself. This has been my most recent work in progress paper. So I have to find those antitheses. And the fact is that I cannot stop looking because I am not allowed to stop looking. And none of us, I think, are allowed to stop looking. And that was the idea of this exercise and exchange. And that's
Thank you very much.